Race Rock and Stratford Shoal Lights are likened to fraternal twins, the main difference in their structures being their roof shapes. These isolated lighthouses were the settings for rescues, attacks, and disappearances. We're diving into the histories of these fraternal twins and the stories of their keepers. I'm Carolina, and welcome to the Lighthouse Narrative. Long Island Sound is a tidal estuary where both salt and freshwater flow. Its saltwater comes from the Atlantic Ocean, while its freshwater is derived from different rivers around the Sound, like the Housatonic, the Connecticut, and the Thames. To the south of the Sound is Long Island, New York, while to the north, Connecticut. At the eastern end of the Sound is Fisher's Island, home to a small community. At the western end of the island is Race Rock Reef, named after the Race, a deep and narrow 3-mile-long channel flowing between Little Gull and Fisher's Islands. Seamen originally called this area the Two-Horse Race, as the waters rushed both ways. Over time, it was renamed the Horse Race, and then finally, the Race. Numerous ships throughout the 1700s and early 1800s fell victim to its turbulent currents. Ships also ran aground at the reef, which was affectionately nicknamed Devil's Shoal. This area was in desperate need of a navigational aid, so Little Gull Island Light was built in 1805 to mark the race's southern end. Its northern side, where the reef was located, remained unmarked for some time, but efforts were underway to remedy this. Instead of a lighthouse, less complicated means to mark the reef were deployed by using small beacons, buoys, and iron spindles, which were tall iron poles with markers. These navigational aids didn't last long as they were swept away by the water currents or knocked over by the ice floes in winter. A day beacon, which was more durable than an iron spindle but cost more to fabricate, was put in place in 1856. But that too didn't survive as it was destroyed by the race in 1863. While conversation of a lighthouse on the reef had been ongoing since the 1830s, it wasn't until the 1850s that it was given more serious consideration. An initial examination determined Race Rock Reef to be a massive boulder. Based on these findings, designs were drawn up, displaying a lighthouse that looked more like a fortress ready for war. It was proposed for keepers to live at Race Point at the end of Fisher's Island, who then have to row a boat through the choppy waters to reach the light. Unsatisfied with the findings, the Lighthouse Board re-examined the reef and concluded it was actually made up of smaller boulders. It was important for this survey to be accurate, as it affected the planned course of action for the lighthouse, which would be an engineering challenge. The race made it extremely difficult to build anything long-lasting, but Francis Hopkinson Smith was willing to take on the challenge. Francis was a well-known engineer, author, and painter. Some of his projects included building the seawall at Governor's Island in New York, the foundation for the Statue of Liberty, and the design for Ponce Inlet Light in Florida. He chose Captain Thomas A. Scott as his foreman, an accomplished submarine diver with experience in marine salvage. Okay, listen, I'd be a fool not to mention any details about the lighthouse's construction because it's considered an engineering marvel in the lighthouse community. So, let's break it down. The first phase of the project began in 1871 with the construction of a riprap foundation consisting of 10,000 tons of stone dumped on top of the submerged reef. This was a mistake because the water currents wrenched the stones out of place, creating an unstable foundation. With this discovery, Thomas convinced the Lighthouse Board that concrete was needed instead of stone. In 1873, the rework of the foundation was underway. 1,000 tons of the previously placed stone was removed until the reef was exposed once again. The stone was temporarily positioned around it, acting as a sort of breakwater. Then, a circular iron band was fabricated and placed on top of the reef, acting as a mold for the concrete to be poured into. Since the reef was underwater, the concrete was poured by divers who could only work a few hours a day when the tide was calm. This step was repeated 3 more times until there was a base of 4 concrete slabs. The stone was then packed around the concrete, and with that, the foundation was completed. The next phase began in 1875, constructing the granite pier on top of the foundation. As the pier was being built, the crew lived on site in shanties, their clothes wet for periods of time. Their living conditions were poor, with periodic lapses in supplies and food, and it didn't help that there were constant delays in the project due to the turbulence of the race, lack of funds, and missteps along the way. It took until 1877 to lay 14 courses or 14 levels of granite blocks to complete the pier. In 1878, the last phase commenced, the building of the actual lighthouse, which took only 9 months. By this point, the design of the lighthouse had changed. Instead of a fortress, it was a keeper's dwelling attached to a tower, inspired by Gothic Revival architecture. The dwelling was 2.5 stories tall, containing 2 kitchens, 2 sitting rooms, 2 dining rooms, 5 bedrooms, 2 cellars, a supply room, and an attic. There is also an outhouse. The tower itself was 3.5 stories tall, leading to the lantern room with a 4th order Fresnel lens, flashing a red and white light. The entire structure was designed with the 3-man crew in mind. Race Rock Light took 7 years to complete construction, the total estimated cost over $275,000. It went into service on January 1st, 1879. Neil Martin was the first principal keeper at Race Rock. He later transferred to other lighthouses to continue his lighthouse career, such as Stamford Harbor and Pinfield Reef. Keepers that came after him had difficulty leaving and returning to the lighthouse due to the strong currents of the race, and oftentimes, they were the ones in need of rescue. Thomas A. Carroll, an Irishman and Army veteran, was an assistant keeper at the lighthouse in 1881. In January of 1886, he was debating returning to the lighthouse after spending time at his home in Nowon, Connecticut. Despite a storm brewing across the waters, he decided to return to the light. This decision proved disastrous, as the storm claimed him for its own. His body later found at Groton Long Point. 24-year-old Christopher Culver was appointed principal keeper in 1891. While he lived at Race Rock, his family lived in New London, Connecticut, so he traveled between the two during his off time. In April of 1892, after visiting his family, Christopher began the 8-mile journey back to the lighthouse in his boat. He didn't get far when R.M. Jerome, a retired sea captain, noticed something amiss. He'd been watching Christopher's boat when he witnessed its sail dropping down. Jerome immediately reported to the authorities that Christopher's boat had capsized. A search was launched but failed to produce the lighthouse keeper. After a few days, newspapers reported of Christopher's death by drowning. But that's not how events played out. What actually happened was Christopher noticed that the rough waters wouldn't allow him to land safely at the lighthouse. The sail didn't drop down on its own. Christopher lowered it so he could row to Great Hay Harbor at Fisher's Island for safety. Once he arrived, he took shelter at a nearby farm for 2 days, without any means to contact anyone. He took a steamer back to New London, where he found his friends and family mourning his death at home, a candle lit in the window. They were very surprised and relieved to see him alive, and for Christopher, it must have been quite the experience to read his own obituary in the papers. On November 25, 1959, newspapers reported on Christopher's actual death, where he passed away a day before at Lawrence Memorial Hospital at 91 years old. At that point, he had long since retired from service and had been happily married for over 69 years. Assistant keepers Arthur Blish and Adolf Hansen wouldn't be so lucky. In March of 1908, Arthur was rowing Adolf to Fisher's Island for his shore leave when their skiff capsized and a storm generated surf. Arthur was able to swim to shore, but Adolf fell unconscious when his head crashed against rocks. Although Arthur was exhausted, he he managed to return to the surf and grab Adolf, taking him to safety. Adolf survived, recovering at Fort H.G. Wright, his head wound having been sewn up. While he recuperated, he resigned from his position because working at the lighthouse was not worth risking his life. Race Rock was automated in 1978, and by 2013, ownership was transferred to the New London Maritime Society. The society also owns New London Harbor and New London Ledge Lights. Fundraisers are hosted every year to help manage, maintain, and repair all the lights under their care. Stratford Shoal is one of the most isolated lighthouses in the Long Island Sound. Since it straddles the border of Connecticut and New York, there's been a long debate of which state it belongs to. The light was built on Middle Ground Shoal, a hazard to maritime traffic. The shoal used to be 2 islands, but over the centuries, rising sea levels submerged them. Like Race Rock, there's been attempts to mark the shoal since the 1820s through the use of buoys and iron spindles. The most successful was the placement of lightship LV-15, referred to as Stratford Shoal Light Vessel in 1838. The ship had varying levels of success as it had its own set of problems. The ship was a floating lighthouse with 1 light on each mast to warn of the shoal. It was home to a crew of 6 men, who had trouble keeping it in place. The ship drifted away 8 days after it went into service because the anchor wasn't strong enough to hold it in position. 2 larger anchors were added to resolve the problem, but the ship persistently drifted away over the years, like in 1875, when ice pushed the ship all the way to Orient Point, New York. In 1876, it drifted away 20 miles to Faulkner Island. The Lighthouse Board made the decision to replace the ship with a lighthouse in 1872. Construction began sometime in 1873 to 74, and while it wasn't as exhaustive as Race Rock, there were still some storms to contend with that delayed the build. In 1877, it was completed and activated on December 15th. A 4th-order Fresnel lens fitted into the lantern room. The cost of the project almost totaled $145,000. As for lightship LV-15, it served as a relief vessel for 2 more years, before being sold to a contractor who used it as a barracks while building Great Beds Light in New York Harbor. William McGlone, the captain of the ship, served as Stratford Shoal's first lighthouse keeper, but only remained until 1880, when he transferred to Stepping Stone's Light. While the lighthouse always had a crew of 3 men, employee turnover was high, since many couldn't handle the isolated location for long. For those who did stay, newspapers and magazines were highly sought after, since they were the only means to connect to a world living without them. When keepers went on vacation or needed to pick up supplies, they had to row a boat for miles before reaching shore. The closest towns were Bridgeport in Connecticut and Port Jefferson in Long Island, New York. In one instance, assistant keeper John P. Hutchinson Jr. left Port Jefferson to row back to Stratford Shoal in 1887. He never made it to the lighthouse. He was believed to have drowned, especially when his boat and his hat were washed ashore a few days later. After some months, his body was discovered at Sinai Harbor near Port Jefferson. His head and his hands were missing. Another disturbing incident played out at the lighthouse in 1905. Gilbert L. Roulon was principal keeper of Stratford Shoal in 1901. Morel Edson Holtz arrived at the lighthouse in 1905 as a first assistant lighthouse keeper, having previously served at Great Captain Island and Well Rock Lights. He was a 54-year-old former packet sailor from Long Island. And then there was Julius Koster, a New York City native, who started his career as a second assistant keeper in 1904. Within the few months of the crew working together, Julius grew antsy of isolated living, and in August of 1905, he snapped. During the time, Morel was in charge of the lighthouse, while Gilbert was away on vacation. Tending to his duties, Morel was completely caught off guard when Julius suddenly attacked him with a razor blade attached to a pole. For the next 5 days, Julius continued to assault and terrorize his coworker, who couldn't afford to sleep since he never knew when Julius would attack him next. Not only that, Morel had to make sure the light in the lantern was on throughout the night, or else the potential of a ship crashing into the lighthouse was high. Julius was unhinged, muttering to himself, destroying walls with a hammer and a chisel. One night, Morel noticed that the light stopped working. When he went to the lantern room to investigate, he discovered Julius ready to destroy the lens with an axe. Fortunately, he was able to convince Julius not to do the deed. By the time help arrived from the mainland, Julius threatened to end his own life. He was taken to a hospital for self-inflicted wounds on his neck. He was subsequently fired from his position and returned home to New York City, where he followed through on his threats and ended his own life. Following the harrowing experience, Morel was awarded a Diploma of Honor from a French organization. That sounds a bit out of the blue since the incident took place in America, but they gave him this award because during the attacks, a French vessel was passing nearby. If Morel hadn't defended the lighthouse from Julius, the vessel could have run aground without the guide of the light. Keepers speculated that Julius Koster's ghost haunted the lighthouse, reporting doors slamming on their own and chairs being thrown around. Julius would not be the first to haunt the area, as there's another story dating back from the early 19th century. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, a ship called the Trustful was preparing to transport a supply of church bells. On the day of departure, the weather grew turbulent, causing some of the crew to worry. The captain was insistent on leaving and said to his fearful crew, quote, "The Trustful will be all right. The devil looks after his own. Anyway, if we do go down, these bells here will never ring in Sodicott, but they may peal a dirge for some of you white-livered folk at the bottom of the sea." End quote. The crew reluctantly boarded the ship, and shortly after, it ran aground at Stratford Shoal. The ship was never recovered, and the crew was lost. It's become a legend that if you sail past the shoal, you can hear the muffled clanging of the church bells emanating from deep within the sea. Despite the lighthouse's dark past, it has a long history of successful rescues. On August 18, 1911, a 3-man crew were on a sailboat traveling from Bridgeport to Port Jefferson. Along the way, the boat capsized in view of assistant keepers John H. Paul and Nicholas Sarr. The sailboat was 2.5 miles away from the lighthouse, but that didn't stop the keepers from making the 5-hour-long journey by boat to rescue the crew. In December of 1919, it was the keepers who needed rescue. Assistant keepers William Pramuka and Harold Hobson were adrift at sea for almost 20 hours. They were traveling to shore when some rope got entangled in the boat's propeller, killing the engine. Throughout the night, their limbs froze, but by morning, they miraculously made it to Port Jefferson. They were hospitalized for 2 weeks, recovered, and returned to duty at the lighthouse. In February of 1933, a teenager named Eddie Connolly went missing after embarking on a clam-digging expedition. Wednesday on the 8th of that month, the powerboat Saugatuck departed Westport, Connecticut to search for him. On the boat was Eddie's mother, Captain John Mahaley, Mahaley's wife, their daughter, Police Sergeant Howard Baker, and 8 other men. To widen the search, 3 of the men were dropped off at Coconut Island to see if Eddie was there. Shortly after, the Saugatuck's tiller broke and the motor died, causing the boat to drift east. On Thursday morning, Captain Mahaley collapsed, so the police sergeant took action. In an attempt to steer the boat ashore, the sergeant used a long plank while lying flat on his stomach at the stern, which didn't seem to improve their situation. As evening came, the boat drifted past Penfield Reef Light and by Friday morning, past Bridgeport Harbor. Cold and hungry, the passengers tried gaining the attention of passing vessels by shouting and even hanging a red sweater from the mast, but these attempts proved unsuccessful. Eventually, the boat drifted near Stratford Shoal Light, Keeper Lewis J. Allen and Assistant Keeper Alfred Arger were on duty when they spotted the Saugatuck, unsure if the boat was in need of assistance. The situation, of course, was much more dire, as the frozen passengers were without food and heat for over 60 hours. In another desperate attempt, they lit a drum of gasoline on fire and dumped it into the Sound, and as soon as the keepers saw the fire, they took swift action. They quickly chopped away at a thick coating of ice on the launching gear to free their powerboat, and made their way to the passengers. Taking them back to the lighthouse, they discovered some of them were severely frozen, especially Captain Mulhaley, whose hands were frostbitten. Luckily, they all survived. As for Eddie Connolly, he was discovered taking shelter at Peck's Ledge Light a few miles away. All persons involved, including the 3 men left at Coconut Island, were safely taken to shore. On June 23, 1955, someone fell from the sky. The engine failed on an F-84 Thunderjet fighter plane near the lighthouse. Its test pilot, Lyle Monckton, ejected and parachuted from the plane, landing in the water. A family out fishing picked up the pilot, while Coast Guard keepers Harry Boyd and William Schumacher went out to meet them in their boat. Lyle jokingly said, "First swim I've had this year." In the late 1900s, Stratford Shoal was considered a retreat by U.S. Coast Guard personnel, who had since replaced civilian lighthouse keepers. There were usually 4 to 5 employees at the light, each employee working 2 weeks at the light and then having 1 week off at home. During breaks, they'd either watch television, read, fish, or sunbathe outside the tower. After almost a century of being a manned light, Stratford Shoal was automated in 1970. It was then added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1990. Race Rock and Stratford Shoal lights continue to serve as aids to navigation, Race Rock flashing a red light every 10 seconds, while its twin flashes a white light every 5 seconds. In terms of access, both lights aren't completely blocked off from public viewing. The Cross Island Ferry from New London and Orient Point have lighthouse boat tours that offer wonderful views of Race Rock Light. The Bridgeport-Port Jefferson Ferry passes by Stratford Shoal, offering distant views. So, if you decide to take either, get your camera ready. Thank you for tuning in to the histories of these lighthouses. Join me next time as we continue to explore lighthouse history and the stories of its keepers. Until then, happy lighthouse hunting.